Prison Days, Book 11. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. Introduction. Welcome to another month of Prison Days. Reaching Book 11 is something I never considered when I first began this series, but watching it evolve has been a dream come true. One of the best parts of this journey is answering the many questions readers like yourself send me. I have a standard rule that I answer every question I receive, and always strive to give an extensive answer. The one thing I find is that many people will often ask the same questions, like why prisoners have certain entitlements. It's another one of the reasons why I enjoy writing these books so much. While not every book contains wall-to-wall incidents of murder and mayhem, they do contain the information so many ask about, thus revealing more and more about the day-to-day life in jail. Whilst I always thought that it was the drama most people were after, it surprised me to learn that it wasn't, but instead just a look into how a prison operates and why certain things happen. Things like how prisoners spend their days, how officers deal with unruly behavior, and what kind of items prisoners are allowed to have in their cells are all questions I've received and have tried to answer. If you have a question, why not send me an email through yourself? I'll be sure to answer and try and provide a worthy response for you. Just don't ask me face to face while in prison, because it's the last place I want to see you. Have you ever been? Whilst prison systems differ substantially around the world, there are also many similarities between them, things that remain the same regardless of how far you travel. If you have experienced prison yourself as an inmate, I'd also love to hear from you. Maybe you'd even like to look into writing your own book, and that is something I can definitely help you with. Okay, here we are again, primed and ready for another peek behind the walls. Take my hand and hang on tight, for this is one place you do not want to get left behind. It's time to go back inside. Monday, April 1st. Somehow, I know that coming in on April Fool's Day is probably not the best idea, but I'm rostered on and that's not something I can change. I'm down for a patrol shift, and with Claire in the driver's seat, I know that codes aside, it should be a pretty cruisy sort of a night. I head straight to the soup's office and get my name down on the patrol roster, selecting a few of the mainstream units for some variety. There's Thompson East and West, as well as Tambo East for me to take care. There's also a note from Claire asking for the visit center to also be searched by those choosing this lot of units. There's already a name written down for my units, but not one I recognize. Considering the number of new officers that have been walking around the prison in recent weeks, I'm not surprised. All I see is the name Anderson, and after cross-referencing it with the duty roster, find that it belongs to a man named Martin. Before heading back to the staff room, I swing by the admissions desk and check out the arrivals still expected in. Being a Monday, I know that it's one of the prime days for late arrivals, not just from court, but also with prison transfers. The numbers aren't too bad, with all of the transfers in and just 6 more court returns due, 2 of whom belong to Thompson East. Craig is manning the book, and I give him my patrol number and ask him to call me on the radio once the returns are ready to be escorted back to their unit. The staff room is deserted when I arrive, and I drop my bag on one of the couches, essentially claiming it for the night. In my bag, I'm carrying a new book, one I'm itching to get started. Ready Player One by Ernest Cline has been on my to-read list for a while now, and after hearing lots of positive reviews, have finally claimed a copy for myself. Another couple of officers enter the room as I drop my dinner into the fridge, and I greet each with a quick handshake before heading out to the sitting area. There's nothing quite like a quick relax before the start of a shift. My radio crackles to life just as I sit, with the caller asking for me personally. I answer with my call sign. Your location? Staff room, I answer. Okay, meet you there, the voice replies, and I slip the radio back into the pouch on my belt. Martin Anderson is what you'd call a solid man, standing as tall as me at just under 6 feet. He's also bald, as well as sporting a decent set of arms. My guess is that he's no stranger to the gym, and his handshake almost confirms it. "Martin," he says, introducing himself once he arrives. "Simon," I reply, then watch as he drops into the chair on the other side of the table. "How long have you been in the prison?" I ask. "Almost a month now," he replies. "Still feels surreal." "I know how you feel, right? I don't think the novelty has worn off for me either." We talk for a while, Martin telling me about some of the experiences he's had since walking the floor. I listen intently, enjoying the man's enthusiasm, which comes across as a kid who's just opened the latest Lego box. Control calls for a movement to cease, and we prepare to head back to admissions once it's called correct. It's easier to take the court returns with us if they are ready to go. If they aren't, then I'm more than happy to help process them back into their prison uniform. It's during our walk back to admissions that I first noticed something about Martin that concerns me. You have to remember that, in this environment, it's not wise to carry a chip on one's shoulder. What I notice is his walk, or, to be more specific, his arms. He walks as if he's carrying a water bucket in each hand, his arms swinging much too far from his body. You know the style, someone walking as if they have Herculean shoulders and will wipe the floor with anyone who dares them to. What's the wording? Watermelon arms? Walking like that is something I guarantee will get you slapped in this place. Not just slapped, but probably wiped out. With a place filled with hundreds of inflated egos walking around, there's very little room for an officer thinking he's the toughest around. There's a very thin line between confidence and arrogance, and the prisoners are unlikely to distinguish between the two. Control call count correct just as we enter admissions and find our prisoners ready to go. I let them out of their holding cell and lead them back out through the front door, with Martin trailing behind. We pass the usual tsunami of officers rushing through the corridors on the way to the front gate, and one of our crooks makes a quip about wanting to borrow a uniform so we can join them. Once back in the unit, we find the dinners left for them on the kitchen counter and give the pair time to warm their food in the microwave. I check the muster for which cells they occupy and head upstairs to the first to wait for them. They both have separate cells, as well as someone waiting for them. It's not until they reach the door that I unlock each cell and usher them inside. The questions from their cellmates are almost immediate, asking about the day, the results, and anything of interest. Their voices fade as I head back downstairs, gesture for Martin to come over, and then proceed to find out what he knows about the searching procedure. It turns out that this is Martin's first night shift, and I start the search with him in tow. I've seen too many officers get needle prick injuries from silly searching habits and try to show him how to avoid them. "Never put your fingers where you can't see them," I begin. "It's the quickest way to get stabbed by a dirty needle. And you know what happens then, don't you?" He stares as he waits for me to continue. 3 months. 3 months of no kissing your wife or girlfriend. 3 months of no kissing your children goodnight. 3 months of finding out whether you've been infected with AIDS or Hep C or one of the other dozens of nasty diseases these guys carry. I've been lucky enough to avoid a needle stick injury throughout my career, and it's one thing I always try to highlight to new officers. It's something that's easily avoided by using common sense. Never run your fingers along anything. Instead, squeeze, let go, move along, and squeeze. I know it takes longer, but it's much safer. I show him on the door seal of one of the unit fridges, carefully squeezing the rubber every few inches. It's a common place to hide pills, shivs, and other contraband. Next, we head out to the laundry, and I show Martin some of the places where it's common to find hidden goodies. The washing machines are a prime example. not only offering great hiding places, but also some of the materials for making weapons. That glorious sheet metal has been popular for many years, providing a razor-sharp edge with a pliable material that's easily shaped into any number of weapons. Once back inside, we split up, with Martin heading upstairs to check out some of the bins, while I head to the kitchen, a great place to find things like homebrew, pills, and weapons, although definitely not as popular as the common area fridges. Whilst we don't find anything of interest in the first 2 units, we do find something of interest in the third. Tambo East is home to a couple of hardcore gangs, and they have an extensive network of hiding places. It's in the laundry that I find a USB hidden under one of the metal counters, attached to one of the bench's crossbeams with a small round magnet. I pocket the item and continue on, keen to add to the USB. There's a very good reason why officers need to put in 100% effort when searching, which is something that annoys me when I find someone who doesn't. Finding contraband and removing it from the units saves lives, injuries, headaches, and hours of paperwork. Things like homebrew, drugs, and medication can and do affect prisoners in different ways, with some turned into lethal and unpredictable weapons. Some prisoners react bad after swallowing pills meant for someone else, leaving others injured or even dead because of it. The same goes for alcoholic beverages. A drunk prisoner is also an unpredictable prisoner, and it can lead to some serious ramifications for both prisoners and staff alike. Finding it and pouring it out is the best way to avoid these incidents. What about USBs, I hear you ask? These may contain either porn or messages meant for some of the gang's hierarchy. It might be an instruction to carry out a hit on an unsuspecting victim, or worse, an officer. The porn could be used to sell time with, leaving some in debt, sometimes for amounts that need to be paid off in blood, creating further danger for staff and inmates. The possibilities really are endless, and it is the prime reason an officer needs to take the time to conduct their searches methodically. If they fail, the repercussions can be life-changing. There's nothing else found in the rest of the unit, but having the USB is enough for me to show Martin how to bag and tag contraband. After showing Claire the item and modeling it for a couple of photos, we head across to the security office to do our thing. It doesn't take long, and before I know it, Ernest Cline is filling my mind with the wonders of the Oasis. If you're an 80s kid or just love the area, this is one book I highly recommend. There are no codes through the night, and by the time we head out to collect our morning quartz, I'm a fair chunk through the chapters. The morning runs like clockwork, and we spend the final few moments of the shift catching up with a couple of early day shift arrivals. Once the clock strikes home time, my feet barely touch the ground as we head to the front. Another shift like this would be perfect, and I cross my fingers in anticipation. Tuesday, April 2nd. It's nice to come in for a shift where everything is just as you remember leaving it. Claire is sitting in the soup's chair, Martin's name is next to the previous night's unit, and I slot into my previous shift's allocation. It just makes the transition from one shift to the next so much easier. After giving Claire a quick greeting and rundown on what's been happening at home, I head back to the staff room and find Martin already sitting where we had first met the previous afternoon. He's sitting back with his eyes closed, an act I can totally relate to. With my dinner packed away in the fridge and my bag sitting on one of the couches, I head back out to where Martin is still relaxing by the fence. I grab a seat opposite and join him in a few moments of nothingness. It's a good few minutes before he begins chatting. He has a few questions about several scenarios he's thought of since our previous shift, the kind of what-if questions most new officers have when starting their journey. Questions like, why don't you handcuff prisoners who come back from court after lockdown? And what would happen if there was a breakout at night? I try to answer each question as best I can, and can't help but smile as I compare them to some of the questions readers send me on an almost daily basis. I wonder whether just handing him one of my books would help. The reason we don't handcuff prisoners who either return from court or arrive from other prisons after hours is for one reason: laziness. The truth is, we should be handcuffing them all. Technically, any moves conducted after hours need to be cuffed, but because of the numbers of prisoners coming in at that time, it's not always practical. Not every officer carries handcuffs on them. It's only around half that have cuffs allocated, which means if you need to escort 4 or 5 crooks to units, it would also mean 4 or 5 trips back and forth. It also depends on which supervisor's on duty, and also whether there are any of the upper management on site. Plus, it also comes down to the type of prisoner we're dealing with, as well as which unit they need escorting to. If it's one of the management units, like Murray North or South, then yes, cuffs are a requirement and will definitely be applied, no questions asked. If it's just a regular prisoner, but they've been wound up or acting out, then we would also use cuffs. It all comes down to the individual and the circumstances. But given the distances walked around the prison and the sheer number of moves made, cuffs tend to be one of those gray areas that is left up to the individual officer, which makes it difficult for newbies because they don't know. As part of tonight's routine, a new transfer arrived into Tambo East earlier in the day, and being a diabetic requires escorting to the medical wing after lockdown to check his BSLs. After-hours medical escorts are another area where cuffs tend to be a gray area. For me personally, I always use cuffs when unlocking a prisoner from his cell after lockdown. The reason why I don't take chances is because when I unlock a cell and give a prisoner the freedom to leave his locked room, he becomes my responsibility, and anything that happens will fall back onto me. If he attacks either myself or my partner, and he's found to be uncuffed, things could head south very quickly. Staff have lost their jobs for such incidents, and I'm not prepared to take that kind of risk. There's one thing I always remind myself of, and that is, I am responsible for my own actions. Yes, there are those that frown on using cuffs, somehow trying to impress the crooks by playing cool. Whilst I've had my own issues with those types, I refuse to put myself onto the chopping block. It's different in admissions because, for one, the soup is right there, and the prisoners are walked past them on their way out. But out in the prison, it's a totally different story. Once control calls count correct, Martin and I head back into admissions to check out the situation and find the place already locked down. A beautiful sight to see. We turn around and head straight out to Tambo East to grab the diabetic for his checkup. Medical escorts normally happen before the searching begins, and the nurses usually wait in one of the treatment rooms until everyone has been seen. It's funny how some of the most basic routines have multiple ways of being completed in this place. You'd think that even just getting a prisoner for a medical escort would be straightforward, or perhaps escorting a prisoner into the unit after hours would be. But the reality is, there are many ways to complete tasks, and for a newbie like Martin, it pays to understand the layout of the land when trying to assess how to work it. I head straight to the station once we arrive in the unit, and find the new prisoner on the muster. Once I've written his details into the movement log, we head upstairs to the cell, and I give Martin the go-ahead to take the reins, whispering some last-minute tips for how to deal with a prisoner. His nervous gaze speaks volumes, and I remind him that everyone has to start somewhere. He swallows hard as we reach the trap, and he twists the latch, opens it up, and sticks his face in the hole. I watch him from the side, taking in how he handles the task. The thing is, he would have had sufficient training during his induction to understand where some of the dangers lie when dealing with prisoners. As I watch and listen, I make mental notes of some of the things I want to highlight to him, pointers that may save him pain in the future. He does all right, holding his own and following the right set of questions. I grab my cuffs and hold them out to him. Martin looks at them for a moment, then grabs them and holds them up. "Why do I need to be cuffed?" I hear the crook ask. Martin freezes, seemingly lost for words. "It's after lockdown, dude," I offer, stepping into view. "Does everyone get cuffed?" "They do after lockdown, yes." He doesn't argue any further, simply holding his hands out through the trap. Martin applies the cuffs with a shaking hand, and when he snaps the first one into place, pushes them way too tight. "Fuck, man," the crook snaps. I grab my keys and quickly unlock them, then reapply them, keeping one of my own fingers between his skin and the metal to ensure enough of a gap. Once the other side is applied, he pulls his hands back inside. I snap the trap shut and gesture for Martin to unlock the cell, as I don't have a key. We escort the prisoner down to the medical unit, and as we head down one of the corridors, I ask him about his diabetes. With my granddaughter at type 1, I have a decent understanding about the condition. "I was diagnosed as a type 1 when I was 16, he answers. "Wow, 16. That sucks, man," I reply. "It's not so bad now. It's been a few years. You get used to it." We chat a bit more as we walk, and once we reach the treatment room, we stand back as the nurse talks with the prisoner. He checks his BSLs, then takes the needle of insulin, dials the right number on the syringe pin, and prepares to inject himself. Now, I've given enough needles in my time to understand the concept of injecting insulin, but watching someone kneel down and stick the needle into their shin is enough to leave me speechless. Well, almost. "In the shin?" I ask, completely bewildered. My doctor explained it to me, and I don't want to get fat around the injection points. "Fat?" I ask. "You get fat around injection points, like your stomach or legs. The shin is one of the leanest parts of the body." Even the nurse watches him wide-eyed, but doesn't say anything. We chat some more as Martin and I escort the kid back to his unit. Listening to other diabetics intrigues me, as many have so many different stories to tell. Once back in the unit, Martin heads to the logbook while I lock the kid up again. He thanks me once I remove the cuffs through the trap again, and I wish him a good night before closing it. Before we begin our searching, I sit with Martin in the station and go back through how he first approached the door and his subsequent actions. I ask him to talk me through what he did, and he's surprised when I point out some of the mistakes he made, mistakes he didn't even realize. For one, he dropped the trap and immediately stuck his face in the hole. His face froze as I told him how that was the best way to get hot watered, or have piss thrown in your face, or worse, maybe even stabbed. Stand to the side when you first drop it. Make sure the light is on inside, and then carefully come from the side until you see the crook. Expect every crook to be waiting with a cup of shit in hand. He listens intently, and once we finish going through the procedure, he thanks me. For me, they're just simple hints and tips designed to keep him safe. In the end, it's up to him whether he chooses to use them. We begin our searching in earnest, and although the first unit provides nothing of interest, Martin finds his first ever shiv in Thompson West. He's almost jumping for joy when he shows it to me, and once we finish the final unit, head back to the soup's office to share his find with her. It's great practice for Martin, who manages to bag and tag the shiv by himself. After sorting the labels and entering the find in the security log, we head back to the staff room and prepare to settle in for the night. I'm almost a chapter into my reading session when Control calls for Martin and I to contact them. We do as asked, and we are tasked with heading back to Thompson East to check on a crook that buzzed up but failed to answer the call. When we reach the cell, we find the prisoner lying on his bed and watching television. He appears okay, and when we get him to buzz Control again, find his intercom not working. After heading back to the station and checking the unit muster, I find an empty cell just 4 doors up, and after approving it with Claire, move the crook into the new cell temporarily. He grabs what he needs for the night, then makes the move, thankfully without complaint. It's not long before I'm once again settled into my chair and losing myself in the best book of the year. Martin sits with a couple of officers from his own course, and I can hear them chatting about his find during the searching. The rest of the shift went by without incident, and the morning court escorts were a breeze, with just a dozen crooks escorted up. With 3 nights off ahead of me, I walk out of prison with a new sense of purpose the next morning, one that sees me heading straight home to bed. Friday, April 5th. Decided to put my hand up for some overtime, and although I received a call very late in the game, just 15 minutes before unlock, I accepted the shift anyway. I considered myself lucky, as overtime can sometimes be fought over by dozens of officers. With lightning reflexes, I answered the call and agreed to a shift in government functions. By the time I made it into the building, the first round of prisoners were only just arriving, and I helped secure them into the holding cells. Once done, I headed to the main office and found the day's allocations up on the notice board. Seeing my name next to one of the courts gave me a bit of nerves, but on the other hand, also a bit of excitement. The role isn't too difficult and simply requires an officer to sit in on the proceedings. Each televised courtroom is a mostly empty room with a chair in the middle for the prisoner to sit on, a television, plus a small camera. A second chair resides against one wall for the court officer to sit, who in this case is yours truly. Below the officer's daily allocations is a second list, this one highlighting all the court appearances scheduled for the day, as well as which courtroom each prisoner is assigned to. Around a half-dozen prisoners' appearances are scheduled for me for the day, the first due to start at 10 a.m. While I'm waiting for the time to tick over, I help out other officers in the building. There are several other duties which need fulfilling, and I'm happy to pitch in. Time tends to pass much faster when I'm actually doing something, rather than when I sit around talking shit. 10 minutes before my scheduled courtroom appearance, I head to room 4 and ensure everything is set up, such as the chairs all lined up, the television on, and the camera powered up. The last thing I want is for a judge to see the room in disarray. Once finished, I head to the holding cell and lead my prisoner back to the room. He's a young kid, and from the look of him, wonder which of us is more nervous. "Ready to go?" I ask him, as he takes center stage. Although the television is on, the screen is blackened as it awaits for the signal from the actual courtroom. "Just hope I get to go home," he says with a shaky voice. We sit in silence for a good 10 minutes, listening to the murmurs from somewhere out in the corridor. The rooms are decently soundproofed, so any sounds that do come through sound like something muffled by a crate full of blankets. The television screen suddenly comes to life, and the judge is addressing whoever is seated in the courtroom. The screen shows the judge behind his bench, as well as where the lawyers are sitting. They sound in deep discussion when the judge begins talking to the prisoner in the room, asking him if he's prepared to meet the conditions which the court has determined to be an adequate sentence. I don't quite follow the conversations, as it includes things from a previous court hearing. My job is to note down any significant decisions from this hearing, so I remain focused on the voices more than the screen. The entire part of our hearing barely lasts 5 minutes, with the prisoner granted a supervision order effective immediately. He's also required to attend anger management, as well as drug and alcohol counseling. I check out his charges and see that he assaulted another driver during a road rage incident while high on meth. Once I've locked the kid back into a holding cell, I hand over the results to one of the other officers and prepare for my next appearance, this one just 10 minutes away. After another quick check of the room, I head over to the holding cell for my next client, this one in for domestic violence and various drug offenses. Each subsequent court appearance lasts less than 10 minutes. While some of the prisoners are happy with their outcomes, some definitely are not. One crook nearly picked up the chair and threw it at the television, and I only just managed to talk him down before other officers came to see what all the yelling was about. Overall, it's not a bad day, and despite the afternoon dragging a little as I wait for my final appearance, knowing that I'm on double pay is enough to keep me interested. Double the rate is not something to sneeze at, and is one of the reasons I wear a smile for the majority of the day. It's amusing when other officers know I'm on overtime simply from the grin I'm wearing. Once the final prisoner has been escorted back to their unit and all the paperwork is filed, we head out as a team. After the standard farewells, I head to my car and think of all the extra money I can use the following pay. The joys of overtime. Saturday, April 6th. It's another patrol shift waiting for me as I return to the prison. The good thing is, it's Saturday night, which means no court returns to worry about at the start of the shift or morning escorts heading to court. It's a proper weekend shift, with the only evening or morning escorts being medical prisoners needing medication and stuff. I head to the duty soup's office and find Eugene sitting in the chair. He greets me with an absent wave as he talks on the phone, something about an ambulance needing to come for a prisoner currently being held in the medical unit. My guess is it's from an earlier code, and he's organizing a trip into town for the crook. Leaving him to his work, I turn to the patrol roster, write my name next to Candace Houghton and the usual protection units, and head out to the staff room. I want to try and get one of the decent couches for the night before they're all spoken for. A lot of the officers tend to prioritize couch selection over unit allocation. There's already a small crowd gathering in the staff room as I drop my bag onto one of the single couches. The majority head out almost immediately, leaving me to drop my dinner in the fridge and catch up with a couple of the remaining officers before lockdown. Halfway through our conversation, Candace joins us, gives me a fist bump, then drops her gear on one of the remaining couches. Before she has a chance to return, a code foxtrot rings out across the radios. The caller sounds urgent as they announce Yara North as the hotspot. We all rush out of the staff room, and by the time we reach the first gate, hear control call for second response. That means the unit isn't responding to the calls for lockdown, and the staff need extra backup. Whenever any code is called, control will generally call for a first response. There's an allocation of 6 officers on each daily roster for first response. These officers are required to drop everything when called on and attend the codes. There are a further 6 officers marked as second response. This group doesn't attend every code unless they are available, or until a second response is called. Second response is also activated if a subsequent code is called while a first is still active. Whilst it doesn't happen often, there are times when a second fight might break out in a separate unit and require another fresh response. We charge through the first gate and run up towards the second, which is already held open for us by an officer manning it. The compound is just a few steps from the second gate, and like the preceding gate, is already held open by another officer. All that stands between us and the inside of the unit now is the airlock, a sequence of 2 doors that slow entry into a unit by limiting the usability of each door. Only one door may be used at any one time, with the other electronically locked until the first is closed again. Thankfully, control override this sequence during a code. The commotion from inside the unit is evident from the moment we burst through the airlock. A lot of screaming is coming from somewhere near the laundry, while rows of prisoners line the top-tier railing, watching whatever is happening with excited interest. The grins on their faces is enough to tell me something significant just took place. 2 officers are standing in the station, with a third just in front of it. I barely have enough time to spot the trouble when tactical officers charge past me and lunge into the crowd. Most of the crooks began dispersing upon seeing the distinctive uniforms enter the unit, fully aware that these guys don't mess around. When the crowd clears, I see 2 prisoners on their knees, with another 2 still wrestling nearby. From the amount of blood on the ground and on the crooks' clothing, I know some significant damage has been done to one of the combatants. While the tactical boys take care of the fighters, the rest of us start locking the unit down, herding prisoners into cells as quick as we can. There are more than a few disgruntled crooks voicing their objections, but we continue regardless. The bottom tier of the unit is now classed as a crime scene, and the less people we have walking through it, the better. Given that lockdown is less than 10 minutes away, their complaints were really just aimed at showing us their contempt for our requests. Like I've said before, they'll do anything to try and intimidate us. It turned out to be a 3-on-1 assault, with all of the attackers armed with shivs. Once the air had cleared and the unit was completely locked down, I stood with one of the officers who was stationed in the unit, and he shared the details with me. The 3 attackers came from different directions and hit their victim all at once. The attack took the officers by complete surprise, coming from virtually nowhere. While 2 of them remained in the station, this guy stepped down and was going to try and intervene, a fact that blew my fucking mind. Really? 3 crooks armed with shivs, and this guy thought he'd run in waving his arms? It was the actions by one of the attackers that I believe probably saved this officer's life. That prisoner turned around and held the shiv up, pointing it at the officer before saying, "I wouldn't." The officer said that the look in the crook's eyes was enough to tell him that he meant it, and thus took a step back and waited for backup. While he may have felt completely helpless in that situation, there's nothing he could have done differently to prevent the fight. Without weapons or enough officers in the unit, their hands were tied from the very beginning. The only thing that could be done was the code called and the unit locked down. Amazingly, the attacked prisoner survived, despite being stabbed 14 times and bleeding out enough claret to cover a decent section of floor. And if there was any doubt over the reason for the attack, the chorus of prisoners calling for the rat to die from beneath their cell doors was enough to dispel them. He'd been talking to one of the supervisors behind closed doors, something viewed by the population as meaning he needed privacy in order to rat out the unit. Control called for count almost 20 minutes later, and despite the rest of the prison heading home a short time later, the officers in Yarra North remained behind to write their reports. The rest of the night staff returned to their own duties, while Candace and I remained in the unit. We had to remain in the unit until the police turned up, and while we waited, sat in the station and checked our emails. Once that was done, we simply talked shit until they finally showed, carrying their bags, cameras, and clipboards. We watched them go about their business for the next 2.5 hours, unable to do any of our own duties. Yes, it was annoying waiting for them to finish, but on the other hand, we were there doing a job and getting paid for it. They finally finished just before 11, and once we had escorted them back out to the front, returned to the unit to start our searching. Thankfully, we were able to unlock one of the unit billets to clean up the blood for the last hour of their investigation, and he finished just before the police did. The 3 shivs from the attack had already been found and bagged, so there was just the standard unit search to conduct. Candace and I each took a side and worked our way through the possible spots. Just over an hour later, we exited the final unit and headed back to the staff room. Thankfully, there were no other codes for the remainder of the night, and I spent the night reading, while a number of boring movies played out silently on the television. Despite starting with a bang, the night wasn't too bad, and once the end of our shift came, I welcomed the morning sun as we walked out. Sunday, April 7th. Another patrol shift awaited me as I turned up, but before I even managed to get inside the prison, Found myself listening to one of my friends as he told me about a code that happened just a couple of hours before. Chris was telling me about another officer, one from our own intake named Joel Hennessy. Joel had been a tactical officer for a couple of years and is probably one of the fittest guys I know. He had been returning from a late lunch in one of the offices down the far end of the prison when a code Alpha was called. He reacted as any officer would and sprinted to where the caller needed help. Joel was the first one on the scene, finding an officer surrounded by a gang of 7 in Tambo West's yard. They were congregated near the gym equipment and appeared to ready themselves for an attack. Joel didn't hesitate, running straight up to the group. But before he had a chance to draw his baton, the gang set on him, kicking him to the ground and swarming over him with boots and fists. Joel managed to brace for the attack by curling into a tight ball, shielding his head with his arms, while pressing his face into his chest. The position protected him somewhat from the kicks raining down on him, and he endured the bashing for almost 30 seconds until the rest of the officers arrived on the scene. 30 seconds may not sound like a lot to you, but take a moment to count out 30 seconds, and then imagine 7 crooks raining kicks and punches on you each and every second. It's a significant amount of time to weather those blows, and Joel was remarkably lucky not to suffer any severe injuries. He was eventually rescued, and the prisoners separated into other areas, pending charges for assaulting an officer. Luckily, Joel walked from the scene and attended the medical unit. He was taken home by a couple of fellow officers, one driving his vehicle home for him. All in all, he was extremely lucky to walk away. The lead-up to the assault occurred because one of the unit officers had gone out to round up any prisoners in the yard in preparation for an afternoon muster. They decided that they weren't ready to leave the yard at that moment and told the officer to fuck off. He, of course, didn't, deciding to remain in their faces and try and take them on single-handedly. When they began threatening him, he called a code. It was just sheer bad luck that Joel happened to be a lot closer than the rest of the tactical officers, or any spare officers for that matter. Arriving first on the scene, he was caught off guard by how quickly they set on him, not expecting a full-on assault. It was an error on his part, an error we all knew he wouldn't be making a second time. The incident is a timely reminder, not just to Joel, but everyone else, that assaults can happen at any time. The greatest enemy we as officers have to fear is complacency, and it is these very incidents that remind us how easily the enemy comes calling. I thank Chris for the chat and head inside, make my way through the reception checks, and grab my keys and radio from control on my way through. After the standard banter at the control window, I continue on through the final airlock that leads out into the prison. Even just coming in this far, I can already sense the change in what exactly? To me, the very air itself feels different in this place, somehow hanging a lot heavier than it did on the other side of the walls. It's the very atmosphere that almost envelops you the moment you step out through that final door. Beside me, the sally port opens and one of the prison transports slowly drives through. My guess is it's probably a medical escort, maybe returning from a quick drive-in to the hospital. I watch it continue on towards admissions as I make my own way down the first corridor. I enter admissions a few minutes later and find Eugene in the chair again. I give him a bit of shtick for sucking up all the overtime for himself, and he flips me the finger with a shit-eating grin on his face. After writing my name next to Candace again, I head across to the staff room and claim one of the comfy couches for myself, then continue on to the fridge and drop my meal inside. Tonight, I have the privilege of a complete roast dinner, including pork crackle and applesauce. It's a delight I thoroughly enjoy. My partner arrives a few minutes later, and we grab a seat out on the deck for a last-minute relax before count is called correct. She asks whether I'd heard about the incident with Joel, and I explain how I know the man. We engage in a bit of chit-chat until Control finally makes the call. We wait a few extra minutes just to give the corridors a chance to clear of the departing officers. It's a Sunday night, after all, and there's really no sense of urgency for us. While some charge for the gate like enraged bulls, we hang back, not fussed with spending a few extra minutes in the chairs. By the time we head off to our first unit, the corridors and hallways are completely devoid of life and sound. The evening is quite a pleasant one, and we continue chatting about nothing in particular as we stroll towards Yara North's compound. Just as the air changes when I first walk into the prison, there's another sensation I detect as I step through the gate and into the yard of the first unit. Yara North lies almost directly before us, maybe 40 to 50 meters ahead. The unit is facing us, with a long line of windows along 2 floors. What I sense is the eyeballs watching us as we casually make our way towards the airlock. There's no denying that they take an interest in us, and when an almost whisper floats down to us, it confirms the sensation for me. Dog. I break into a grin and continue towards the airlock. It feels good to be back in familiar territory after being absent from the unit for a whole day. Candace chuckles a little, and we both get it. Water off a duck's back. The searching is just as it always is, intriguing mixed with a little bit of anticipation. Despite checking some complete out-there places, we turn up empty-handed after all 3 units are searched and return to the staff room for a night of reading, snoring, and B-grade movies. The morning escorting is nothing worth mentioning, with 11 prisoners heading off to court, none of whom my partner and I bring up. We hang around admissions and lend a hand to process them before finally loading them up on the 2 buses and effectively ending our shift. It was a good night, and I look forward to a few nights off as we exit a short time later. Thursday, April 11th. I think what surprises me most with this job is the fact that no matter how many times I think I've seen it all, there's always, and I mean always, something new that comes along and surprises me even more. It makes me smile to think that no matter how weird, outrageous, and insane the events I witness get, something fresh and shocking is always waiting for me around the next corner. And today just happens to be one of those days. It's a patrol shift for me, and arriving a little later than usual means unless I get my butt to the duty soup's office, I could potentially miss out on choosing my units. That is, of course, if the duty soup hasn't already filled in the sheet. Thankfully, the patrol sheet is still mostly empty, with just a couple of names down on the list. I decide to take Glenelg East and West and Loddon South. They're still protection units, but just a different type of protection. Actually, to be honest with you, the name I saw already written beside my usual choice of units wasn't one I wanted to spend a night shift with. It's not that they're a bad officer, just not someone I would choose to spend 12 hours with, if you know what I mean. Gary is sitting in the hot seat, and thankfully too occupied to have his own way with the unit assignments. He's busy trying to fill a couple of shifts for the following day, having received a number of phone calls from officers taking the day off sick. I'm not sure if I've ever mentioned this before, but calling in sick in this place is not what you would call normal. I've made the call myself a number of times, and always find the look on my wife's face amusing when I do. Let me take you through a recent call, so you have a sense of what I'm talking about. I pick up my phone whilst my wife is driving us to the shops. We have an appointment to attend the following day, one that came up quite quickly. It's too late to try and organize a shift swap at work, and so I decide to simply take a sick day. The good thing is that each year, unused sick days roll over to the next, giving you a bank of them. So, anyway, I pick up the phone, dial the number, and listen as it begins to ring on the other end. The call is picked up after just 2 rings, and I hear Claire's voice on the other end. "Duty soup," she answers. "Hi, Claire. It's Simon. How are you?" "Yeah, good. How's your day off?" "Good, thanks. Hey, can I please grab a sick by 1? I'm down for patrol 3. "Sure thing. Just the 1? 1 is fine. Thanks." I hang up and look across at my wife, who has a grin on her face that is a cross between surprise, being dumbstruck, and outright confusion. Actually, if a WTF expression ever existed, it was now staring back at me from across the seats. "What just happened?" The tone added to the expression perfectly. "I took a sick day." My wife grunts, shakes her head, and takes off from the lights, almost disgusted as I half laugh at her. The thing is, when you call in sick, they just want to know the day you go sick, for how many, and what shift you are allocated so they can replace you with someone. This replacement is someone either looking for overtime or someone allocated a spare shift, which means they're rostered without actually having an allocated role. There's no trying to sound sick, coughing, or trying to sound like you just chewed your own arm off. On a more serious note, there's a reason why we don't need to try and play act in order to grab a sick day. The reason is simple. We work in a high-stress, high-pressure job where sometimes a sick day is utilized just because you need an extra break. Perhaps the shift was a tough one. Perhaps there was violence, a death, or another substantial incident. The job we do is different to most other places. It's unlike getting yelled at by an abusive customer or steamrolled by a client who is expecting a different result. It's different to being scolded by a boss who didn't give clear instructions for a job they needed you to do. What we do is work on an endless battlefield, with the front line located anywhere behind the walls. There are walking, talking, ticking time bombs all around us, and sometimes they explode, causing untold damage to those in the immediate vicinity. That's pressure, and it takes a toll. When I first mentioned to my doctor where I work, she told me that if I ever needed a day off, all I needed was to ask and she would give me a certificate. It's no different to those employed as police officers, firefighters, paramedics, or those tasked with attending traffic accidents or other places of doom and gloom. Sorry for getting distracted. I just like to share the world we live in, and sometimes it takes me to some out-of-the-way places. Anyway, back to the night shift, and the reason Gary was too busy to fill in the roster, leaving us to choose our own units. The word library is also written next to my unit allocation, giving my potential partner and I an extra area to search. And when I check the medical run, there are also 2 names for Glenelg East, with 2 diabetics to walk up, both after lockdown, as well as before unlock the following morning. As I'm about to head across to the staff room, I hear a commotion back around to where the admissions crew normally hang out near the book. There's a lot of animated talking, laughter, and general riffraff, and I decide to see what the story is. As I round the corner, I see maybe half a dozen officers standing around, several of them laughing hysterically. One of them is telling a story that's animated enough to get its own television show. Unfortunately, I came in too late, and the punchline is past. But from the look of the other officers, it's worth taking around the block for a second time. "Did you hear the news, Si?" the storyteller asks, and I shake my head. What he proceeds to tell me not only sets the rest of the gang off for another hysterical fit of laughter, but shocks me to the core. Plus, it brings Gary out from his office asking for the noise to drop. It's not something I have ever heard happening before, and try to run the images through my mind. The incident involved a supervisor named George Martin. He's the kind of supervisor most people steer clear from, for one very good reason. He loves his job. No, wait. Love isn't strong enough of a word. This guy lives his job. How can I best describe George? He stands no more than 5'2" tall, is openly gay, and is forever angry at everything he comes across. Greet him on your travels, and it's a 50-50 chance whether he bothers to acknowledge you at all. I've seen this guy tear shreds off the biggest and baddest brute of a prisoner without ever breaking into a sweat. Put simply, he's a prick, loathed by most, loved by none, and that's exactly how he likes it. The story goes that he was in the psych unit earlier in the day during his usual rounds. He had paused briefly to listen to a conversation between the 3 officers on duty in the unit. They were sitting in the station, with one of the ladies sitting with her back to George. The conversation was about men and her dating displeasure. About halfway through the story, George decides that he needs to be involved and mumbles something about this lady needing more than a man to satisfy her. She turned a little and told him that he did as well, and that was when George leaned forward and, how can I say this? He leaned forward and licked this woman's ear. She pulled away a little in disgust, made some comment, and then George decided to follow the first licking with a second. He leaned right in, pulled the poor woman back, and proceeded to lick her head. The other 2 officers shrieked in horror as large clumps of drool became embedded in the victim's hair, with a long dribble of spit hanging from the chin of George. Let me repeat that. He licked a lady's head and slobbered in her hair. What the actual fuck? George ended up being called to the front, had a brief meeting with management, and was subsequently removed from the prison. You think? How somebody can even think about doing something like that and imagine the person is going to sit down beside you and have a good belly laugh? I think the look on my face must have been a genuine expression of shock, because the crew broke out into even more fits of laughter, bringing Gary from his office a second time. After pleading for a bit of peace, he returned to his office and I headed across to the staff room, the image of George licking the lady's head playing repeatedly in my mind. After grabbing my usual couch and dumping my food, I returned to admissions to lend a hand with the incomings. I saw a couple of prisoners for each of the Glen Elg units still to come in, and figure it's probably easier to be there when they return, in case it's after lockdown. Turns out my partner, some new guy named Norman, is already waiting for me in admissions, and after a brief introduction, he follows me to where we strip and process the crooks. Because it has been a while and there's nothing quite like needing to strip a man after a day at court, I ask Norman whether he would like to take the lead while I spot him. He agrees and heads into the cubicle with our first client. Control calls for movement to cease a few minutes later, and we pair up to conduct a count of the building. Once the number had been phoned through, we continue to process prisoners until count is finally called correct right on time. Norman and I head to where our crooks are being held in a cell, let the officer on the book know which units we're looking after, then proceed to identify our cargo. After a few final checks, we head out and make our way down several corridors. We take the first crook to Glen Elg East, while the second crook waits in the airlock for us. We could bring him into the unit, but for the sake of simplicity, let him wait instead. It eliminates any issues in case he decides to kick up in a unit he isn't assigned to. I quickly fill in the unit logbook, then help Norman walk the crook back to his cell. After we head next door and repeat the process with our second prisoner, we take care of the medical escorts. It's a straightforward process, and these types of escorts normally happen quickly and efficiently, as the person being escorted wants to get through the process as fast as possible and return to their cell. It's almost 9 by the time we start our searching, with Norman taking the kitchen in the first unit while I head to the laundry. There's nothing to be found in either location, and just as we head back towards the airlock, Norman points out a very slight rise in the carpet in front of one of the end cells. I follow him over, and as we get closer, confirm his suspicions. The metal edging had been pried up, and sitting beneath the carpet is a flat piece of sheet metal that has been fashioned into a makeshift shiv. As Norman takes the weapon, I do a complete lap of the unit, slowly walking along the edge of the carpet and ensuring there are no other weapons hidden. Only once I've finished a second lap do we head next door. We repeat our searching in the next 2 units and find nothing else. After finishing, we head back to admissions and grab the evidence bag and log and start our reports. It doesn't take long for us to complete the necessary paperwork, and once we've dropped the weapon off at Intel, return to the staff room to chill. With no codes through the night, we do very little until our court escorts. There are 3 from Glenelg West for us to bring to admissions, and once we drop them off, head back out to finish our final escorts for the shift, those being the medical ones. Overall, it was a pretty good shift. Norman was a great officer to work with, spending most of his time talking about his previous job as a train driver. I asked quite a few questions, and it helped pass an otherwise boring night. But as you and I know, there's always some excitement waiting around the next corner. Friday, April 12th. Friday evenings always seem to have a different kind of buzz around them, as if the very air itself can detect the weekend straight ahead. From the moment I make it into the prison, there's a certain sense of excitement in the atmosphere, particularly around those officers heading the other way, on their way out the door. It's a patrol shift that's waiting for me, and I head straight to the duty soup's office. Eugene is in once again, another overtime shift for him. I can't imagine just how inflated his pay packet must be each week. Simon, can you hang around here? Don't worry about putting yourself down for the units. I give him a thumbs up and head to the back of the building to drop my gear in the lunchroom. Once I've put my food in the fridge, I head around to see the person on the book and find out just how busy it's going to be for the evening. It's Scott who's running the book, and when I take a peek at the escort list, find out that there are still 22 courts to return, plus almost a dozen transfers from a country prison. Going to be a long night, Scott mumbles under his breath, just as another bus driver enters the building carrying his run sheet. How many? I ask, and he flashes 3 fingers at me. I got them, I said to Scott, and he nods, marks the names off his list, and hands me the indents so that I can go and take the prisoners off the bus. What's an indent, I hear you ask? An indent is a sheet of paper, or a number of sheets, depending on the prisoner, that contains a great number of details. First and foremost, there's the prisoner's details, including name, date of birth, and prisoner number. These 3 details are what I use to identify them, as well as their identity photo located in the top right of the cover sheet. Following these details, there are some other identifying points, which include body descriptions, identifying marks or tattoos, plus a list of their charges, dates, and outcomes to date. Next is the person's travel permit, better known as a court-ordered warrant. This has some very specific details on it, including the court order and ID number that permits us to release the prisoner into the care of the transport service who have been tasked with bringing said prisoner to the court. Sometimes, prisoners will have several warrants, and it's the person on the book's job to ensure that there is a current one for that very day. It's not uncommon to find older warrants also affixed to the paperwork, and that can make things a little more complicated. Because the prisoners are returning from court, the other important piece of information that must be checked is the outcome from that day's appearance. It's imperative that this information is ascertained before we take them off the bus, because if they were supposed to be released, then we cannot legally take them back into custody. And before you ask, yes, that is exactly what has happened in the past. Back when I first started in admissions, it wasn't uncommon to be dumped on the book without any sort of instructions on what to do, while the rest of the crew stood back, each with a bucket of popcorn to watch the show. It wasn't easy, and mistakes were common. I still shake my head at how some officers were treated back then, and have always tried my best to make sure I share as much knowledge with new officers as possible. A lot of experienced officers do the same, as we remember what it was like when first starting out. Checking to confirm the outcome from a court appearance may be as simple as checking the dates and the sentence handed down. Sometimes, it's not uncommon to need to count the individual days, even using your fingers if needed. It's not that rare to find a prisoner who served 58 days, be sentenced to 60 days, and find themselves due for release in 2 days. We can legally remove them from the bus if they have at least a day to serve, and sometimes that's how close it is. Scott checks the indents, the results, and only hands them to me once he's happy for the prisoners to come off. If there's ever any question of doubt, an officer should always seek a second opinion. It's imperative to get it right. On this occasion, everything's good, and I head out to the line and call for the transporting officer to release the prisoners. I have 2 other officers standing beside me to help, with one ready to escort the prisoners into holding cells. The first to come off is a protection prisoner, and I call for him. He jumps down and almost skips to the line, happy to have his sentence end within a few days. I run him through the identification process. He answers my questions, and my offsider walks him to a cell while we continue with the other 2. It's a process that repeats itself multiple times a day and is mirrored by anyone running the lineup. Once back inside, we return to where the prisoners are processed, each strip searched, before returning them into their prison uniforms and subsequently their units. Protection crooks need escorting, while mainstream prisoners make their own way back. That is, until control calls for movement to cease in anticipation of lockdown. Court returns are easy to process, as it's just a matter of stripping them and sending them on their way. Transfers are a different story. Those crooks not only need to be strip searched, but they also receive a meal which is served to them in a takeaway container. They need to be interviewed by admission staff. Plus, they must see a medical nurse. I've personally seen prisoners take up to 6 or 7 hours to go through the process during extremely busy times. The good thing about the nurse's interview is that it must be completed within 24 hours of arriving. So, if things get too late tonight, those needing their interviews will simply be escorted up to admissions the next day. As long as they have an interview with a staff member upon arrival, it's okay. It is during that interview that the questions are asked about their mental state, any concerns they may have, and any questions they need answering regarding their transfer. We continue processing court returns right up until control makes the call, rushing prisoners through as quick as possible. Anyone remaining after lockdown will need escorting back to their units, and that's where extra officers need to be called up to do the escorting. The prisoners help us out during the final few minutes before movement is ceased, going through their moves without any bullshit. They're as keen to get out of there as we are. As we hear control make the call over the radio, there's a unified groan throughout the building, and we finish the strips we're on before calling a stoppage. After a quick sip of water, I partner with another officer and we conduct a quick count of our area, opening each and every holding cell to ensure we don't miss anyone. 5 minutes later, I hand the number to Scott, and once he has a second and the third officer confirm my count, he calls it in. It's only once he's happy for us to continue that we start getting crooks out again. I barely hear a control call count correct as we continue processing the court returns. By the time I finally take a breather, the final court return is in the middle of climbing off the bus. I head back to Scott about the ETA of the transfers, and it's not good news. It turns out their bus has literally broken down on the side of the road, and they need to be transferred onto a new bus. I groan, knowing the ramifications of the breakdown. If you think it's easy to transfer prisoners from one bus to another, guess again. For a start, several police units will need to attend and surround the buses, with more stationed on each door. And if that's not enough, the police helicopter will also need to be hovering above the scene, its bright spotlight needed to keep the entire area illuminated throughout the transfer process. They're expecting them to arrive around 11 tonight. That means I will be in charge of taking them off the bus, processing them into the prison, and then escorting them to their units. Scott hands me the sheet, and I check the names and units just so I can be prepared ahead of time. Because they will be arriving at such a late hour, the nurses' interviews won't be started until the next day. We won't be processing their property either, which will no doubt piss some of them off. But that's not something I really care about. And because they are coming from another mainstream prison, the crooks will already be wearing prison-issued uniforms, which means I won't have to worry about any civilian clothing. Whilst it is a pain having them turn up so late, it shouldn't be much of a hassle to get through the building quickly, especially with some decent staff on hand. Once a few officers escort the final few court returns back to their unit, the admissions crew prepare to head off for the night. Their job is effectively finished, and after a final few last-minute instructions, bid me a good night, leaving me to sit and twiddle my thumbs until the bus arrives. I let Eugene know where I'll be waiting, then head back around to where the book is kept. It's the computer I want, and once I log in, begin checking my emails in the silence of the unit. It's almost peaceful as I sort through the messages, pausing briefly on those that seem interesting. Once finished, I shut the computer down again, and instead grab a blank sheet of paper. It seems like as good a time as any to try and work on my upcoming release schedule. Not just book ideas, but actual works I intend to publish in each of my series. It's one of my favorite pastimes, as it gives me an indication of where my author career is headed. There are still several Max books on the horizon, and I jot down a few ideas for titles. There are also a few Sam Raider storylines I still want to pursue, with one definitely going to shake things up. This is probably one of the more exciting ideas for me personally, with the definite possibility of a brand new series coming straight after Book 6. Is this called a reveal? I'm so engrossed in what I'm doing that when the phone starts to ring, it barely registers. When I pick up, it's Jane from the control room, telling me the bus with the transfers is just coming through the Sally port. I thank her, grab my radio, and put the call out for all available staff to assist with the incomings. By the time the bus pulls into the admissions compound, half a dozen officers join me at the book. When one of the transporting officers finally hands me the indents, I check them against the list before me, tick each one off, and then lead everyone out to the line. The crooks' voices can already be heard as we watch the officers start to open doors one at a time. I call for 2 lots of 4, followed by a third cell of 3. Check each prisoner's details, and once they've confirmed their ID to me, wait for one of my offsiders to escort them through to a holding cell. Once we have all 11 prisoners inside, I sign the transport's paperwork, bid them good night, and return indoors. My first job is to make sure everyone's aware of the procedure ahead. Although I'm expecting to cop a bit of shtick from the crooks once they find out that we're not processing their property tonight, they all take the news on the chin. My guess is they're all just as keen to get to their units as we are to get them there. While 4 officers start the stripping process, I start interviewing each prisoner one at a time. It's the only part of the process that needs someone qualified, as it involves checking the right boxes on the computer. I had already made up their night packs ahead of schedule, which includes a toothbrush, toothpaste, soap, a pair of fresh underwear and socks, a small bag of sugar, and some tea bags. Their ID cards are also sitting inside the bags, as each already had an up-to-date photo on the system. As each prisoner is finished, they're escorted through to the main holding cell, and once each unit is ready to go, a group of officers walks them out. Thankfully, by the time I finish interviewing the final crook, there are only 2 prisoners left in the main holding cell. It takes less than an hour to process all the crooks, and as I watch the final one head out with his escort, flick the light switches off. With no escorts to worry about in the morning, and no units for me to monitor, I have a choice to either head over to the staff room and hang out there, or remain at admissions and continue my previous planning. I choose the latter, and spend the rest of the night letting my pen run free with book ideas, titles, possible characters, as well as possible publication dates. By the time the end of the shift arrives, I have a significant piece of paper safely tucked into my shirt pocket. For me, the weekend has finally arrived. Monday, April 15th. It's back to Murray North for me, and as I head into the prison, I'm not entirely sure whether I'm happy with the allocation. Have I ever told you just how much I hate working in that unit? It's an endless night of being on display, not just to the prisoners, but also management. There's been a lot more talk about management constantly tapping into the camera system on their cell phones after hours, and it honestly makes you feel like you have to constantly be on your toes with what you're doing. Chris is sitting in the station as I come through the airlock, with the rest of the crew finishing up final duties for the shift. As I close the inner door and make my way to where he's stationed, I instantly see what will turn my usual relaxed night into an outright nightmare. Sitting along one of the countertops are management watch logs, as well as suicide watch logs. In all, there are 8 books, consisting of 5 management watches and 3 S watches, 2 of which are S1s. OMFG! Busy night for you, champ, Chris heckles as he holds a hand out. We shake, and I simply shake my head before turning back to take my food to the fridge. All in all, the unit is fairly quiet as a whole. I check the unit muster when I return to the station, and thankfully find none of the usual names I despise, those crooks that can turn a quiet night into a complete shit fight. The 3 suicide watches are all new crooks to the jail and simply tried to manipulate their unit postings, ending up in here due to the lack of observation cells out in the rest of the prison. The management watches are all new arrivals into the unit, each required to undergo a mandatory 24 hours on watch to monitor for any problems. It's not long before handover time is finished and control calls a correct muster. The gang barely blink before disappearing out through the airlock, leaving me alone in the unit. Their voices trail off as the silence of the unit takes over. I take a moment to just sit there and take in the usual quietness. There's barely the sound of a television, a hint of music, or a wayward fart. It's as if midnight came early and everyone's taking a nap. Sinking a little further into my seat, I find the quietness almost unsettling. Almost. A quiet spell in this unit is definitely not something to frown at. Quite the opposite, in fact. After spending a few minutes listening, I head over and check out the washing machines and find 2 stopped but still containing wet clothes. I transfer them into the dryers, then return to the station and check out my watches in more depth, reading each of the reports to get a better sense of what's going on with them. It turns out that all 3 suicide watches gave the exact same spiel to the psych nurse, saying they couldn't go to the respective units because they were scared and would hurt themselves if they were made to. 2 out of the 3 are protection prisoners, although I don't know what charges brought them to the prison. All of the crooks on management watches were transfers from incidents out in the units. 4 of them were from the same incident, an attack on a 5th prisoner. These 4 were spread out, with 1 up on the top tier, 1 on the bottom, and the other 2 down the isolation wing. I would be covering a lot of miles to check on each one of them. Straight after my first complete round of checks, I return to the dryers, bag the one that's finished, and walk it up to the relevant cell before starting another walk to my 2 S1s. This is going to get old really fast, I thought to myself. 4 times an hour for the entire night, plus 1 complete lap for the others each and every hour. Thankfully, the unit remained mostly quiet for the majority of the night. I don't know whether it was something in the air or an incredibly long and intriguing movie on the old tube. Maybe some station was showing the entire Star Wars universe in one sitting. Whatever it was, The night that I thought I was going to have before I entered the unit was definitely not the night which eventuated for me. Aside from covering a lot of ground, there was very limited prisoner interaction the entire shift. While I did peek into a lot of cells, most of them were asleep for the majority of checks. Only one acknowledged me twice through the night with a proverbial finger, while the rest greeted me once I handed breakfast through the trap. All in all, it was a pretty decent night. Tuesday, April 16th. You know how I keep mentioning that no two shifts are ever the same in prison? Well, it turns out that it couldn't have been more true if we compare last night's shift to tonight. While there may have been something in the air last night, which kept the crooks settled, tonight there must have been something in the water, and I mean that quite literally. From the moment I step into Murray North again, the unit is alive with the wrath of hell itself. Half a dozen crooks sound as if they're about to break down their doors, burning the absolute funk out of a new arrival who's been housed in one of the bottom-tier cells. There's also one persistent dickhead in the isolation wing who's busy trying to flood the entire unit. When I check the name, I see that it's one of my previous night's S1s. Chris smirks at me as I enter the station, and I dump my bag on the floor beneath one of the benches and drop into a chair. "Go on," I said half-heartedly, waiting for the handover. Not only can I barely hear him, but the ringing in my ear is beyond irritating tonight. Wait, have I mentioned the ear ringing to you before? I don't think I have. More on that a little later. Chris begins by taking me through the watches I have for the shift. Thankfully, the number is reduced by 5 from the previous shift. One of the S1s is now an S3, while the S3 has left the unit. The one remaining S1 is the one flooding his cell, pissed because the television in his cell isn't working. That leaves just a single management watch, which is an acceptable number of watches for a shift. Chris continues his handover with the washing, which has all been completed, save for a single load just finishing in the dryer. The new arrival, the one currently sitting through his first night in the place he will call home for a few years, is the creator of some questionable videos involving children. Kiddie porn is probably one of the worst things you can be sent to prison for, and I don't mind sitting through the entire night listening to them burn this prick. Aside from the new arrival, the S-watches, the flooding, and the management watch, there's not much else for Chris to share, and I'm struggling to hear him anyway. He simply nods to signify the handover complete and sits back as we watch the rest of the crew finish their last-minute duties. Just as always, control calling count correct is like someone announcing the buffet open at a wedding reception. The rush for the door looks very similar, and I watch as the officers disappear into the night. The crooks barely notice the shift change, with the burning continuing uninterrupted well into the night. Aside from a single call from someone asking me why the movie channel is paused, the unit population let me be, their focus firmly in the kiddie porn director. Thankfully, the crook flooding his cell decides to give up after I promise to try and find a replacement aerial cable, the only thing missing from his television. It's little effort for a big reward. While there are none in the unit, a quick phone call next door locates one, and I arrange for a patrol officer to pick it up for me. Not long after my first round of checks, I take care of the only load of dried washing, deliver it to the appropriate cell, and return to my usual place in the station, doing my best to ignore the symptoms I've been experiencing more and more in recent weeks. I know I haven't mentioned it much, if at all, but I was recently diagnosed with Meniere's disease. If you hadn't heard of this before, it has a few delightful symptoms, as well as no known cure, which means it's here to stay. The first symptom, and one that is probably the most annoying, is an endless ringing in the ear. We're talking full-on crickets and lawnmowers when at its height. I say when, because the volume of the ringing changes quite randomly, although I think it might have something to do with diet. The second symptom is complete deafness in one ear. This one really pisses me off, especially when I'm driving a car, because if I have a passenger, it's really difficult holding a conversation due to my good ear facing the window. Also, by only having one working ear, noisy environments are almost completely impossible, as I only have one ear to process a lot of different noise. Try to speak to me in a crowded room, and it's a complete waste of time. Even watching a movie has lost its appeal, as the sound system I use is now useless, with surround sound not really possible with one ear. The third symptom, which can be extremely debilitating, is vertigo. If you have ever suffered from vertigo, then you know what I'm talking about. It can hit at any time, and when it does come with all its fury, can cause me to simply curl up in a ball. You see, the form of vertigo I get isn't just dizziness. What I get is a complete loss of sight, with the world suddenly spinning before my eyes to the point where I can no longer focus on anything. Because of the relationship between the ringing, the vertigo, and my hearing, loud noises have a weird effect on my eyes, with loud banging causing my vision to physically move. I know it sounds weird, and I've seen the looks of confusion from those I've tried to explain it to, but my eyes actually move in small jumps from loud noises, which can then bring on a fit of vertigo. Sitting in an explosive unit with dozens of screaming prisoners and the constant banging on steel doors, I'm almost in agony as I sit in the station. To try and help ease the symptoms a little, I pop in a couple of earbuds. They don't do as much as I hope, but reduce the severity some. It's all I can do. There's not much I can do about the noise, and in a weird way, enjoy the crooks burning the newcomer. Their insults are both clever and funny, and given their intended target, I'm accepting of the suffering. The unit finally calms just after midnight, with the final crook heading to bed after a final barrage of screaming. In between the checks I still need to do, I've tried to get some writing done, but apart from getting a few lines down for a fresh max idea, there's not a lot of flow to my work. Between midnight and 5, I watch television and continue with my rounds as needed. The second officer arrives shortly after I start preparing for breakfast and takes over the patrols as I get the bread all toasted up. The morning duties go by nice and smooth, and although the ringing in my ear is quite substantial, I try my best to hold a normal conversation with the staff as they arrive for their shift. Once there are enough people in the unit, I make my escape after a final farewell and head home for a well-earned break. Saturday, April 20th. It's a patrol shift for me tonight, and I find Gary in the hot seat when I arrive. He's already filled the sheet in, and I find myself allocated as a spare officer, which means that not only are there too many officers on duty, but I don't have an allocation of units to look after. Whilst you might think of this as a win, it's actually not. By being a spare means if anything was to come up, I would be the first officer on the list called to sort it out. This could include getting stuck in a unit and watching an S-Watch, called upon for an out-of-prison escort, or any other number of duties. Yes, it may have its advantages to a certain degree. It also doesn't, as I'm someone that would rather know what he's doing ahead of time. With admissions closed for the weekend, plus no morning court escorts to worry about, Saturday is normally the quietest night of the week. Add to that the fact I have no units to look after, and you can see that boredom is a definite possibility. I head to the staff room and drop my food in the fridge, throw my bag on one of the couches, and head back out to grab a seat before lockdown. But before my butt hits the chair, Control call a code Mike in Yarra North, and I decide to go and help out. The code turns out to be someone suffering chest pains, the kind that can be used to get out of a unit for a few hours if played right. The crook, an old guy named Walter Smith, is a 60-year-old pedophile that has been in the unit for the better part of 5 years. He's also a notorious troublemaker, always getting involved in shit that doesn't concern him. Think busybody. Once the nurses turn up and run their tests on him, they ask for him to be transported up to the medical wing. I help another guy called Carlo push the stretcher to the medical unit and deliver Walter to the treatment room. They strap him to the ECG monitor, and after a few minutes of the machine doing its thing, the nurses ask for an ambulance to be called. As the soup phones for the ambulance, Carl and I remain with Walter until the paramedics arrive. It's almost an hour before they show, and once they finally wheel the patient into their waiting ambulance, Carl and I return to the staff room. As if sensing that I'm about to eat, Control call a second code mic just as I pull my food from the microwave. I groan as I sit it covered on the bench and join the others in heading to Murray South. It's a few minutes' walk, and once we arrive in the unit, find the officer standing at the trap of a top-tier cell. "Up here," he calls to us, and once we reach him, tells us it's for a toothache. It's a pretty normal story, with the crook told to wait until after count before asking for help so that night shift staff would get medication for him. It's what you call lazy day staff, more interested in going home than performing their duties. Once the nurses showed and check on the prisoner, they give him some pain relief and promise to book him an appointment with a dentist for the next day. According to one of the nurses, the prisoner has an abscess and needs to see the dentist as soon as practical. As we follow them out of the unit and prepare to return to the staff room, Control call a third code, and I honestly wonder whether these had been planned. Sometimes you won't hear a code for days on end, and then, suddenly, you have them occur back to back. This one is a code Foxtrot in Thompson East, and when we arrive, can already hear the commotion from one of the cells on the bottom tier. Several other prisoners are egging the combatants on from their own cells, and when we drop the trap, see two crooks facing off. One is bleeding from a cut above his eye, while the other is gushing from his nostrils. Separating the two is a breeze once the soup okays the door to be cracked. We cuff the first through the trap first, then lead him aside as we cuff the second in the cell. It takes less than 10 minutes to deal with the pair, Gary clearly not in the mood for games. The first crook is escorted to Murray North by a couple of tactical officers, while the second is taken to medical first, then on to Goulburn West. Their current cell is simply locked and left as is, to ensure neither has their belongings touched by anyone else. Once I get back to the staff room, I briefly stare at my food and wonder whether I should just eat it cold. Spaghetti bolognese isn't something I normally fancy cold, but in reality, how many times can it be reheated in a single night? I decide against a cold dinner and sit it in the microwave, thumb in 3 minutes, and watch as the dish begins to spin in the window. "Code Mike, Avoca," is called across the radio, and I begin to laugh, a loud and obnoxious laugh one might hear from a crazy person. Carl stares at me from his spot on the couch, and I think the prospect of me actually being crazy crosses his mind. I don't even bother taking my dinner out of the microwave, and simply turn and head out of the staff room, following the rest of the crew. Avoca is towards the far end of the prison, and it's a decent 5-minute walk to get there. By the time we make our way through the airlock, the soup and the officers in charge of the unit have already cracked the cell. It's a fall, and the crook is still lying on the floor when I reach the open door. The nurses are the last ones into the unit, and we stand aside as they head over to do their thing. Thankfully, a couple of the other officers have brought the stretcher, and after a brief exchange with the prisoner, the nurses call for it. After taking a shower, the crook slipped in a puddle of water and sprained his ankle, but it didn't end there. On the way down, he reached out to catch himself, got his fingers somehow caught on the side of his bed, and broke 2 of them. Thankfully, the floor caught him before he could damage anything else. As I watch the prisoner helped out of his cell and onto the stretcher, I stand back and notice how some things never change. As the nurses call for someone to help the crook out, I watch almost everyone shrink back, with a few physically walking back. And here, it's different. It really is an us and them mentality, and officers do not want to be seen getting hands-on with a crook. That feeling doesn't run one way either, with prisoners just as keen not to be helped by an officer. Remember, there is always someone watching from both sides. For us, the cameras and fellow officers are right there, and if they see someone helping a crook, quickly turn it into the next day's gossip. For prisoners, there are always eyes on them, either from under cell doors or from other vantage points, anywhere where a prisoner can spy on the proceedings. And for them, the repercussions can be much more severe. Some might go as far as suspecting the prisoner of ratting someone out. It really is a different world in here, and the rules one needs to learn can be quite numerous. Thankfully, by the time I finally return to the staff room, my dinner still has a faint hint of heat, and I simply eat it as is. I really can't be bothered wasting any more time on it. Once finished, I wash the container, drop it back into my bag, and sink down into the couch, with nothing but the television between me and the end of the shift. And with no escorts to worry about the following morning, it's a smooth sail to the front gate ahead. Sunday, April 21st. I was expecting to come in for another patrol shift, but as I walk through the control room airlock, I'm asked to head into the sally port and take over from the day shift person as it's the end of their shift. After dropping my bag just inside the door of the control room, I head around through several doors and corridors and end up out in the cold. While the sally port is essentially inside, the open-weaved doors do nothing for the chilly wind blowing through them. Thankfully, I have my jacket with me and put it on almost immediately. After wishing the other officer a good night, he leaves and I grab a seat at the only desk in the oversized garage. The only vehicles that come through at this time of the evening are transport buses, and Scott, the control room officer, calls out that there are only 3 due in, with 2 currently sitting in the admissions compound. I give him a thumbs up, give the bunch of magazines hiding in one of the drawers a quick once-over, and select a fresh-looking one that contains a few crosswords. Both the inner and outer doors are completely controlled by control, and my job is to check the vehicles and the officers themselves. This includes giving each driver, officer, a once-over with a metal detector, and the buses a complete check of the doors and front cabin. The officers also tell me the number of prisoners they are dropping off, which I then pass on to the control room officer. Just as admissions keep a running log with a book, as do control. It is those running logs that keep a tally of the number of prisoners in the prison, and as each muster is called, the holder of those logs compare their tally. If any of them don't match, there's a scramble to find out why. And there's a third book as well. That one kept in the area known as records. Records is right near admissions and is where most of the paperwork for escorts is kept. It's not long before my first customer arrives, and once the inner door is closed again, the driver hops out and picks up their cell phones from the locker. This is one of the outgoing buses and has no prisoners on board. After a very quick walk around for a check of the doors, I give control a thumbs up. They open the outer door and we wave out the bus. Before the door is closed, one of the remaining inbound buses arrives and I wave him straight in. Once the outer door is closed, I wait for the 2 officers to jump out and then check them for any contraband. I then jump into the cabin and check for anything out of the ordinary, before hopping out and asking for the number of prisoners on board. I hold up 4 fingers to control, and a few moments later, the inner door slowly rattles open. It's almost another hour before the final bus finally exits the prison, and once the outer door rolls down, I head back inside to the warmth of the control room. Scott is busy handling a code mic that just came through, and I begin to grab an armful of radios from the drop tray and begin slotting each into a charging station. With almost 100 radios to get through, it can be quite a lengthy process, and all of them need to be fully charged by morning. Scott eventually finishes with the code and starts allocating keys to the next day's shift, which is another job that takes time. We chat about nothing in particular, each going about our business before another interruption comes up. Aside from handling the codes that get called, Control also answer intercom calls from every unit that isn't manned, which in itself can be quite cumbersome, especially when one of the many arseholes decides to make themselves known. You know the type, the ones that don't really want anything, but just need something to kill their boredom. A few other officers drop in to give us their pizza order, and by 10 o'clock, the control room stinks like a regular pizza house. It's a good way to spend some time, and with nothing else really to share, I see out the rest of the night by watching movies. The only other thing worth mentioning is the wake-up calls I make around 5 the next morning. The intercom is my choice of weapon, and I simply buzz each crook, make sure they're awake, then move on to the next. There are only 15 in total, and so finish in under 10 minutes. It's a pretty good night, and I hope that I find myself in the control room a bit more in the future. I have a couple of days off now, and look forward to kicking back and doing absolutely nothing. Except, maybe, writing a few chapters here and there. Wednesday, April 24th. I've always said that hindsight is a bitch. Sometimes it's a bitch for other people as well. Remember Martin Anderson? He was the new officer that liked to walk around carrying watermelons under his arms, maybe imagining himself having a set of shoulders like The Rock. It turns out that some of the crooks wanted to test just how strong he really was, and one of them took a swing, breaking his nose with a single punch. I heard about the incident from Chris on his way out through reception, the place I worked in tonight. A couple of other officers also shared their version, but none told it quite like Chris did. He always knows how to add just the right amount of tone and drama. Unfortunately, Martin Anderson isn't the only incident that I hear about, with another officer high on the list of gossip for the day, although this one is something that pisses me off a whole lot more. The officer's name is Peter Townsend, and he's been an officer in the prison for almost 10 years. I always had a decent amount of respect for the guy, all of which evaporated in an instant tonight. The other thing you should know about Pete is that he's been married for many years and also has a teenage child. The thing I liked about Pete is that he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when there was work to be done. He got in and helped, especially with more junior officers, showing them the right way to do things. Unfortunately, it turns out he also enjoyed showing them a different side of the prison. Peter had been systematically propositioning female officers and sexually harassing them for months. It took one courageous lady to come forward for the other 6 to also step up and tell their story. Once management found out, they gave Peter an opportunity to tell his side of the story, and then walked him off-site. As I listened to the details from several officers, I can't help but shake my head. Why? I have a personal hatred for cheaters. My belief is simple. If you don't want to be with someone, then leave. If you find that your partner no longer makes you happy or doesn't give you what you need in life, then do them the courtesy and just leave. But to keep them in the dark as something like a backup in case your cheating ways don't quite work out is despicable. No sympathy from me whatsoever. There's a giant tub of mail waiting for me, and once the final officers head out of reception after control is called count correct, I dive straight in. The funny thing is, As soon as I open the first and stare at the barely legible handwriting, my insides cramp as I remember the last time I sat here doing the same thing. Reading prisoner mail is not fun, whatever you might believe. It's not. While it does have its humorous side at times, for the majority of the letters, it's just not. By 10 o'clock, I feel like my brain is going to explode from frustration, and I decide to get some fresh air out the front. The last of the nurses are just heading out, and I follow them out to the car park, ensure the visitor building is all locked up, and take a quick look up at the night sky. As I gaze at the wonders of the universe, I hear Murray North faintly on the evening breeze, the burning reaching beyond the walls. There's a code called over the radio, and I head back inside, lock the front door, and switch off the majority of the lights. For me, that is as exciting as it gets for me, with just the letters to keep me company for another few hours. The soup drops by around 2 in the morning, and after a very brief chat about Peter, he heads off to finish his rounds, while I log the final bits of property in the storage locker, ready for those crooks coming the next day to pick up their gear. With the property and the mail finished, all I can do is wait for the newspapers and the end of the working day for me. It's not much of an exciting shift. The only thing that I will say is that the ringing in my ear isn't too bad tonight. I had a touch of vertigo as I walked in for my shift, but it mostly stayed away. While this disease may not be as serious as some of the others out there, it's taking me a bit to get used to. I just hope it doesn't get worse. Thursday, April 25th. I came in expecting to sit in reception again, but was instead asked to go and sit in the psych unit as the regular officer had to go home sick. That left a reception officer to take her place, and personally, I'd rather sit in the psych unit than spend another night with the male. One quick phone call to Claire, and the swap was done. The psych unit really isn't too bad, and as I enter the officer station, spot a crook that I haven't seen in some time. He stands out to me because he once used to be a billet in admissions when I worked there. He's in for murder and was sentenced to 20-plus years just a few months ago. When did he get back? I asked one of the officers sitting in the station. Who, Lewis? Couple of days ago. Tried to neck himself. No way, I replied, quite surprised. Let's not go overboard, the other officer piped in, holding a hand up to stop proceedings. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Neck himself? That fucker wouldn't have the balls. Jeannie always has a way with words. Okay, maybe it was a little too ambitious a word, the first officer added. He wound a sheet around his neck and then pretended to lie unconscious on the floor until an officer found him, and when the mark on his neck wasn't red enough, he tried to pinch himself to inflame it. Say no more, I offered, crooks playing the system for their own advantage. The 3 observation cells were all empty, and that meant as long as no one new was brought into the unit, my night should be a nice and quiet affair. I checked the roster to be sure, and am relieved to find no names that immediately jump out. We sit around and spend the final few moments discussing the head-licking incident with George Martin. The humor from admissions isn't replicated here, with the story viewed as disgusting instead. The 3 officers seated before me are all ladies, and none of them see the funny side, all of them extremely disgusted by the incident. Just as it happens in other units, the moment control call count correct, day shift disappears in a flash, with just a brief wave all that separates them from the unit and tsunami of officers already walking out along the path. I wait for a few minutes to make sure everyone's gone, then switch the majority of the lights off. The nurses that sit in the unit permanently have their own office off to the left, and I can see them sitting at their computers through a small side window. At present, there are 2, but once the night shift comes in, their number will reduce to just 1. I turn to the computer just as the intercom rings, and when I answer, am asked for some pain relief. Before I can even cancel the call, one of the nurses is standing behind me. "Was that Collins?" I check the muster to make sure and nod my head. "Okay, give me a second." The nurse heads out of the station and heads to the pill room without any sort of objection. This is surprising to me, as normally prisoners would first be questioned, as most of them try to obtain drugs through deception. The nurse returns a few minutes later and asks me to accompany him. I do as asked and follow him to Collins's cell. After dropping the trap, the nurse steps forward, hands the crook the small pill cup, and stands back for me to watch the medication be taken. There's no hesitation, with the prisoner simply taking the pill, swallowing enough water, then presenting me his open mouth for inspection. To tell you the truth, I was a little bit mystified. If this had happened in Murray North, the crook would need to spend a good couple of hours buzzing the officer's station repeatedly while the on-duty officer begged for attention from the nurses. It might even take a phone call to the soup to get something done. And yet here, the crook buzzed up and was handed his pills before anyone could blink. Whilst the intention may have been admirable, what worries me most is what would happen if other prisoners caught wind of it. But as I'm just a lowly officer, I know it's not up to me and simply close the trap and return to the station. My job is simply to monitor. It's not long before the night shift nurse arrives, and it's not someone I recognize. It's a man in his mid to late 50s, of African appearance, and seems a little hesitant in his demeanor. He introduces himself once the other nurses head home, telling me his name is Charles and that he's just started in the prison the previous week. 30 minutes into our conversation, I was starting to wonder whether he had forgotten where he was. When I say that the man could probably talk the leg off a chair, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, this guy could talk. Wow. Even just writing this takes me back to that night. I remember sitting there wondering if I was ever going to get away. When he spoke, there were no gaps, almost as if he didn't need to breathe. He was telling me about his home country of Zimbabwe, or Zim, as he referred to it. I'm not kidding when I say that after an hour of listening to him, I began to picture myself still sitting there as a fossilized skeleton as he continued on and on and on about his childhood, growing up in Africa with no shoes, and how he was once gifted a pair, and how liked to keep them shiny by polishing them each and every night. 80 minutes! That's how long he kept me sitting there, telling me his life story. It was only by sheer luck that one of the prisoners finally buzzed up asking for their normal nightly medication. I wanted to hand that crook the entire jar as a thank you for saving my life. I think he did. I swear I thought my joints had already seized up from sitting there for so long, my head on nothing more than a pivot made for nodding. Charles is a lovely man, don't get me wrong, but seriously, learn to take a breath every now and then and maybe check the pulse of the person whose ear you're chewing off. Needless to say, I put my head down for the rest of the night and pretended to be very busy whenever he came out to do his rounds. I think it was around 3 in the morning when I felt a bit of guilt for trying to avoid him, and I asked Charles if he wanted a cup of tea. He did, and we sat and chatted for a little longer. It turned out that we both shared an interest in photography, and that was something I could talk about for hours. As we sat and chatted for almost an hour, I felt guilty about what I had thought of Charles when I first met him. While there's no denying that he loves a chat, once I found a subject I was passionate about, he became so much more interesting. While the night wasn't much to write about from an exciting incident point of view, I did manage to make a new friend, and that's valuable. With just a single night left in the month for me, my hopes are high for a nice relaxing shift to finish things off. One can only hope. Friday, April 26th. As I pull into the parking lot in front of the prison, I see an old friend pulling his car into one of the spaces, and after parking my own, hurry over to him. Fancy seeing you here, I tell Khan as he climbs down from his truck. We shake hands, and I find that he's also on patrol tonight. We make our way into reception, and as I'm passing through the detector, hear a code Alpha called over the radio. A second later, Control announced the code to the prison, highlighting Avoca as the destination. We continue through the process, and after grabbing our own keys and radio, pass through the airlock into the prison itself. I barely close the door when a second code is called to the incident. The second code is calling all available staff, and we begin running up the long corridor to drop our gear into the staff room so we can head over to the unit. We don't make it to the staff room. A third code is called while we are still a few dozen yards from the staff room compound, and it's a code I've only heard personally maybe 2 or 3 times in my career. Attention all stations. Code Charlie. I repeat, Code Charlie. All available staff to Avoca. A code Charlie calls for the entire prison to be locked down. It means every unit will now lock up their prisoner population, with workers returned to their units under escort. There's a very good reason for the code, and it's a scary thought to process. The code is used when the staff resources are stretched too thin, and if another code was called in a different part of the prison, would stretch resources beyond capability. A code Charlie simply eliminates the possibility of any other significant event occurring. Instead of continuing straight up the pathway, Khan and I turn left, head through one of the medical buildings, drop our bags near an officer station, and shortcut our way to another corridor on the other side. From there, it's just a quick run across the Tambo East compound, down another corridor, and into Avoca's compound. A flood of officers run past the gate as we emerge from Tambo East's compound, and we join them, racing for Avoca. But just as we reach the airlock, are called to pull back as pepper spray has been deployed inside the unit. Remembering my own experience with the stuff not long ago, I take several steps back and instead turn for one of the medical buildings that's located between units. Inside, I find boxes of bottled water, and I grab 2, steady myself as much as possible, and begin to run them back. I see officers already emerging from the unit, many holding their faces as they try to ride the pain of getting a face full of spray. Khan helps me hand out the water bottles, and officers start to flush their eyes with them. Inside the unit, the tactical officers have 4 crooks on the ground in cuffs, with the rest of the unit locked down. 2 officers have sustained injuries, including a broken nose, 2 lost teeth, a fractured cheekbone, and a significant concussion. The assault began when one of the prisoners was told he would be receiving a cellmate later that evening. The unit was running at capacity and needed to turn a single cell into a 2-outer cell holding 2 prisoners. The occupant, a rather large Samoan, didn't like the idea of sharing with anybody and refused, threatening to cave the cunt's head in. But after being told by the supervisor that there was nowhere else for the new arrival to go, decided to hit out instead. He took on 3 officers plus the soup and had 3 of his friends follow him into battle. I can't say the fight was anything significant, as 2 of the officers were in their late 50s and far from the prime of their lives. The third was a lady in her early 20s, and often compared to a lit firecracker, always close to snapping point. Then there was the supervisor, a man renowned for lighting spot fires around the place and then walking away so others could deal with them. The doors to the unit remain open to try and clear as much of the spray out as possible. It will need a deep clean before anything else, and the hierarchy are already on top of it. Thankfully, it's a Friday night, and the weekend offers somewhat of a quiet spell. There's no doubt that Avoca will remain in lockdown for a day or 2 anyway. The final muster is delayed by around 30 minutes as the cleanup continues. Only once everyone is sorted do Khan and I return for our bags, then head to admissions and fill our names out on the patrol muster. We take the usual protection units of Yarran North and South, plus Loddon North, then head over to the staff room to drop our gear. We don't hesitate and immediately head to our units. While admissions was still expecting transfers, there were only 2 due in, and they were both mainstreamers. Although one was destined for Avoca, he's been rerouted to Campaspe instead. The 4 crooks from the Avoca incident were also sitting in holding cells in admissions, with the main perpetrator transferred out of the prison an hour later. Yarran North is almost completely silent as we enter through the airlock, with just a faint hum of music coming from one of the far cells. I decide to take the kitchen, and once inside, do a quick check of the fridge. As I bend down to get to the bottom shelf, an instant bout of vertigo slams into my head like a hammer, and I have to hold on to keep myself from falling over. My eyes won't focus on anything, and all I can see are shapes spinning before me, with a weird pulsating in my head. Thankfully, nobody sees me, and the incident passes within a few minutes. I've read somewhere that these types of bouts can sometimes remain for hours, and I cannot imagine how I could cope if one was to strike me. It's only once I'm sure the vertigo is truly gone that I make my way back out into the unit to finish searching the rest of it. Just as we're about to leave, there's a knock on one of the doors near us. It's from one of the observation cells, the prisoner inside separated due to refusing a directive. When I tap back and ask him what he wants, he asks for his light to be turned off, which I do. There are no light switches in observation cells, which means one of us needs to turn them on and off. The other 2 units turn out to be fruitless in terms of contraband, but we do spot an unlocked cell. It's only because the prisoner inside has taped a sponge to the door rim that it didn't swing open. Prisoners tape pieces of sponge to their doors to keep them from slamming. It also keeps them from opening due to the resistance the wedged pieces of foam offer. On this occasion, the foam worked in everybody's favor. Once we finish our searching, Khan and I return to the staff room, eat our dinner, and catch up on the latest gossip. It's good to catch up with him, finding out about what he's been doing, especially since his heart attack. He also tells me about a suicide that happened earlier in the week, one that I hadn't heard about. A prisoner by the name of Robert Thatcher necked himself on the Monday just gone. He'd torn bits of bedsheet off and tied them around the hinges in his cell door. The thing about cells today is that they're supposed to be suicide-proof, with no hanging points anywhere. But because prisoners sometimes use the door hinges to hang stuff from, like makeshift clotheslines and stuff, no one really thought twice about it. He was found during morning muster, probably minutes after I'd walked out from my shift that morning. Robert had been in and out of prison many times, and was the kind of crook that would remain in the system forever. I guess you could call him institutionalized, and for some reason, I guess he no longer wanted to play the game. Khan and I reflect on some of the incidents we remember of the man as we continue our catch-up. We chat for almost 2 hours before we're interrupted by a code mic in Yarran North. It turns out to be the crook in the observation cell, asking for painkillers for a headache. Once the nurses arrive, they run a few checks on him and then deny his request. He's not happy with the outcome, but agrees to settle down for the night. It's a good thing, because none of us want another code. The rest of the night continues incident-free, and apart from the ringing in my ear, relax for the most part without issues. With no escorts the following morning and a few nights off, it's a happy morning when we finally return to our vehicles. I give Khan a final hug, ask him to say hello to his beautiful wife, and finally head home. It's another month done for me, and I wonder how much longer I can last with the increasing symptoms.